Winter on the Eastern Front was not just cold, it was an invisible enemy, constant, cruel. The air cut through the lungs like ground glass with every breath. The temperature plunged so far below zero that exposed skin burned as if it were touching red-hot metal, only in reverse. There was no real shelter from it. The German trenches looked like open graves in the frozen earth. The mud had turned to stone. The snow wasn't white and clean. It was grey, dirty with soot, gunpowder, and old, frozen blood. Soldiers had been there for days, some weeks, without changing their socks, without drying their feet, without sleeping properly. Their eyes were sunken, their beards overgrown and covered in ice crystals, their cracked lips bleeding when they spoke. They no longer trembled. That was the problem. Their bodies had already passed the trembling phase. Now it was just a deep, dangerous exhaustion. Fingers stiff as wood. Some could no longer feel the rifle trigger. Others rubbed their hands, incessantly trying to regain the sensation, knowing that freezing meant losing their fingers or their entire hand. The smell was a mixture of gun oil, old sweat, damp fabric, and the metallic odor of rust mixed with blood. The silence was never complete. There was always something, the distant crack of freezing wood, the creaking of leather, a man coughing dryly, someone murmuring his wife's name while sleeping sitting up. The ammunition was counted one by one. Each soldier knew exactly how. Many magazines remained. There was no excess. There was no easy replenishment. The line was thin, stretched to its limit. On the other side of the white, lifeless field, beyond the low mist that creeped over the frozen ground, the Red Army was moving. It wasn't possible to see clearly, but it was possible to feel. Shadows, movement, the distant glint of metal, the muffled sound of shovels digging into positions. Short voices, quick orders in Russian carried in fragments by the wind. The Germans knew what that meant. They had seen it before. It wasn't the kind of battle that started slowly. There would be no light skirmishes, no isolated shots. When it came, it would come like a human avalanche. A soldier in the trench raised his head slightly, only his eyes above the edge of the frozen ground. The world seemed still, but his instinct screamed otherwise. He swallowed hard. His breath turned to vapor before his face. "It's about to begin," someone murmured. And the worst part wasn't the noise that was yet to come. It was that moment before, that weight in the air, that invisible pressure crushing the chest. The primal sensation of prey waiting for the predator to emerge from the fog. There was no silence. There was life expectancy. On the other side of that barren field, the cold also gnawed at Soviet bones. But there, winter was not just suffering. It was a weapon. The Red Army had learned to fight through suffering. Many of those men came from villages where winter killed as much as hunger. The cold no longer frightened them. Defeat did. Soviet commanders didn't think like Western generals, calculating acceptable losses. There, the math was different. The question wasn't, how many are we going to lose? But rather, how many do we need to sacrifice to break the line? The doctrine was simple, brutal, almost primitive in its logic. Press until it breaks. They knew that German machine guns were deadly. They knew that the open field was a slaughterhouse. They knew that many would not return. Even so, the plan was to advance en masse, wave after wave, like the sea crashing against a wall until the stone cracked. In the Soviet positions, the men prepared themselves in heavy silence. Some kissed religious medals hidden under their uniforms. Others clutched folded photos of mothers, wives, children. Many didn't even have enough rifles for everyone. Some carried ammunition, others grenades, others simply the order to pick up the weapon of whoever fell in front of them. Officers moved between the ranks with harsh voices but tired eyes. Behind them, even more feared figures, the political commissars. Long coats, cold stares. They didn't need to shout. Their presence said it all. No one backs down. The wind whipped up the fine snow, like phantom dust slipping between boots. The soldiers breathed heavily, releasing white clouds into the dark air. Each of their hearts beat too fast, too loudly, as if it wanted to escape from their chests. They weren't going for an elegant, tactical maneuver. They were going to cross a field where men would be cut down like wheat by invisible blades. But there was something greater than fear there, national despair. The burned villages, the dead families, the destroyed cities were behind them. For many, it was more than just a military offensive. It was revenge. It was survival. It was pushing the enemy out of their land, no matter the cost. An officer raised his whistle, but didn't blow it yet. He looked at those faces, young and old at the same time. Some trembled. Others seemed empty inside. The field ahead seemed endless. The man next to the other whispered, "Run, don't stop. Don't look to the sides," because everyone knew the truth. In that doctrine, the individual didn't matter. The wave mattered, and the wave was about to rise. It came first as a distant sound, a muffled thunderclap, almost indistinguishable from the wind rolling across the frozen plain. Then the sky opened. The first Soviet artillery shell landed behind German lines, raising a column of earth, ice, and shattered wood. Half a second later, another, and another, and then there was no more counting, just a continuous sequence of explosions, as if the earth itself were being battered by invisible giants. The ground trembled beneath frozen boots. Snow, ice, and chunks of hardened soil rained back into the trenches. Soldiers cowered, pressing their helmets against their heads, their mouths open to avoid bursting their eardrums from the shockwave. Boom! 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 The air was devoid of oxygen, only smoke, dust, and the acidic smell of explosives. Each impact rattled the chest from within. The earth from the trench walls came loose, falling into coats around the neck, cold and damp. A projectile struck a machine gun position to the left. There was no scream, just an orange flash and dark debris flying. When the smoke cleared, the cover simply vanished. "Heavy artillery!" Someone shouted, but no one needed to warn anyone. The Germans had seen this before. The bombing wasn't meant to destroy everything. It was meant to disorient, to crush the nerves, to make a man want to bury himself alive. The sound was so constant, it became a solid wall of noise. You couldn't hear orders. You couldn't think. You could only survive the next impact. Shrapnel whizzed through the air, a sharp, deadly sound. A soldier raised his head for a second longer. A fragment pierced his face like a hot knife through butter. He fell back, bewildered by what had happened. Another man gripped the rifle so tightly that his knuckles were white, even in the cold. His lips moved, repeating the same phrase over and over, like a prayer without God. The white snow had vanished. Everything turned grey, brown, black. The landscape resembled the interior of a frozen volcano. And then the veterans realized something worse than the noise. The standard. The artillery was moving forward, advancing little by little, adjusting its aim closer to the trenches. That meant one thing. The bombing was not the attack. That was the sign. When the cannon stopped, the silence that followed would last only a few seconds, and in those seconds, death would come running on two legs. And then, as suddenly as it began, the artillery stopped. The silence fell like a weight. Not a peaceful silence, but the silence after a scream, when the ear still rings and the brain refuses to believe the sound has ended. Smoke crept across the field. The earth, still, trembled slightly, as if afraid of what was to come. German soldiers slowly raised their heads, eyes wide, their hearts pounding in their chests. Some coughed, spitting mud and blood. Others simply listened. They knew this was the moment. On the other side of the dirty fog, a thin sound cut through the air. The whistle. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was the deadliest sound of that day. And then they appeared. First as shadows moving in the smoke, then as human shapes, then as a mass. Hundreds of Soviet soldiers rose almost simultaneously, leaving their positions like ants spilling from a destroyed anthill. Some shouted, others ran in absolute silence, faces locked, eyes fixed ahead. It wasn't an organized line. It was a human flow. Boots sinking into the dirty snow, bayonets swinging, heavy coats billowing in the wind of the run. Many gripped their rifles with both hands as if it were the only thing keeping them alive. Others carried grenades strapped to their chests. Some stared at the ground as they ran, unable to face what lay ahead. Behind them, officers shouted orders, and further back still, the figures no one wanted to see. Blocking units. Weapons pointed not at the enemy, but at the backs of their own men. The message was clear, even without words. Move forward, or die right here. The open field that had once seemed empty now pulsed with movement. The mist was cut by silhouettes running, stumbling, getting up again. The sound of boots mingled with shouts, panting breath, the metal of weapons clashing against bodies. In the German trench, a young soldier whispered, his voice faltering, "My God!" A veteran nearby was already rotating his machine gun into position because everyone knew what was coming next. That wasn't a patrol. It wasn't recognition. It was a human wave, alive, breathing, screaming, rushing straight into the fire, and they were still a long way off. But they were coming fast. The first machine gun shot sounded like a tear. In the fabric of the world. Then the others came. The MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns began spitting fire almost simultaneously, positioned at the edges of the trenches, supported on tripods embedded in the frozen ground. The sound wasn't like ordinary gunfire. It was a furious buzzing too fast to distinguish individual shots, a continuous mechanical roar. Brrrt! The bullets pierced the fog and found the first Soviet line still in flight. Men simply vanished from the race. One was there, running with his rifle pressed against his chest. The next instant, his body was spinning in the air like a boneless rag doll. Another fell to his knees before realizing that half his coat had been ripped off along with the flesh underneath. But what froze the blood of the Germans was not seeing the men fall. He went to see the ones in the back, not slowing down. They trampled on those who fell. They stumbled. They fell. They got up again. The crowd kept pushing. The German gunners shouted out. Numbers to change overheated barrels. Steam rose from the machine guns, mingling with the smoke. The smell of gunpowder was so strong it burned the eyes. "Further to the left! Further to the left!" someone yelled. Bullets swept across the field, carving corridors of death in the snow. The white turned dark red in wide, jagged patches. The sound of the impacts on the bodies was a heavy, damp noise that the men would never forget. A Soviet soldier was shot in the leg, fell rolling, but continued, crawling, pulling his own body with his arms, leaving a dark trail behind him. Another ran screaming, clutching his open stomach as if he could still hold everything inside. And yet, they were coming. For every man who fell, two more appeared behind him. For every space opened by the bullets, the tide closed again. Inside the trenches, the Germans began to sense something new. It wasn't just tension, era, unbelief. "They won't stop," someone murmured, reloading with hands that could no longer feel their fingers. The field ahead no longer looked like a field. It looked like a conveyor belt carrying men straight to their deaths, and yet it was still full. The machine guns didn't stop. They couldn't stop, because if they stopped, the wave would come. The snow no longer looked like snow. The field between the Soviet and German positions had transformed into an uneven carpet of craters, bodies, and scattered equipment. What had once been an open space was now a rugged terrain made of the dead, wounded, and wreckage. And it was there that something happened that many German and Soviet veterans would remember for the rest of their lives. The bodies began to become shelter. As German machine guns swept across the field in constant bursts of fire, the Red Army soldiers who could still move learned the hard way how to survive that corridor of fire. They threw themselves to the ground, not just by instinct, but because the field itself offered macabre protection. Recently fallen bodies, backpacks, discarded rifles, pieces of wood, and earth ripped up by explosions formed small mounds. Every inch of height could mean the difference between living a few more seconds or being hit in the chest. Men pressed themselves against still warm corpses, the vapor of blood rising in the icy air. Some didn't even realize they were pressing their faces against a dead man's coat. Others knew and simply didn't care anymore. The instinct to move forward had replaced disgust, fear, reason. Historically, attacks of this type were seen at various stages of the war in the East, especially between 1941 and 1943, when the Red Army was still rebuilding its tactical capabilities after devastating losses. Many offensives were launched with limited preparation, imperfect coordination, and rigid orders to maintain constant pressure. The objective was not strategic elegance, it was to wear down, saturate, and break through. In the field, this translated into men crawling under continuous fire. The survivors of the Soviet front line no longer ran. Now they advanced in short leaps, diving into the craters opened by artillery. One threw himself after a body, another rolled behind a torn backpack, a third used his own rifle, stuck in the snow, as support to lift his head and calculate his next move. The screams were different now, no longer cries of rushing forward, but short, instinctive sounds of pain, of effort, of lungs burning in the frozen air. The smell was suffocating. Gunpowder, churned earth, and the metallic odor of blood, which in the cold grew thicker, darker, almost black. In the German trenches, the snipers noticed the change. They were no longer firing at men running with their chests exposed, but at figures that appeared for seconds and disappeared behind irregular mounds. The efficiency of the machine guns was decreasing. It was necessary to expend more ammunition to hit fewer targets. "They are crawling closer," a sergeant shouted, his voice hoarse. And it was true. The distance was decreasing. The field, which had resembled an open slaughterhouse, was slowly turning into a grotesque bridge made of human sacrifice. Each falling body offered cover for the next. It was a slow, horrific progression, but real. This was the psychological shock that many German soldiers later described. The realization that firepower, however devastating, was not infinite. Barrels needed to be replaced. Ammunition ran out, arms grew tired, nerves failed. But the mass on the other side seemed endless, and for the first time that day, some defenders felt something that training hadn't taught them to control: the doubt. Because even that open-air massacre wasn't enough to stop the advance. So what would it be? By this point in the battle, the field between the lines was no longer just terrain. It was an uneven surface made of craters, destroyed equipment, and men who had fallen minutes before. The snow had vanished under layers of dark earth and thick patches that froze almost as quickly as they spread. The cold cruelly preserved everything, as if winter itself wanted that scene to be etched in memory forever. The Soviet soldiers, who were still advancing, no longer ran upright. They had learned, in a matter of minutes, the brutal logic of survival in that hell. Every body ahead became an obstacle and also a shield. They threw themselves behind the fallen, pressing their chests against still warm coats, using backpacks, canteens, and even stiff limbs as improvised barriers against German fire. It was a slow, creeping, almost animalistic progression. They crawled, pulling their own weight with their elbows, their fingers sinking into the mixture of snow, mud, and freezing blood. Many left their rifles slung over their shoulders just to be able to use both hands. Their breath came in short, desperate gasps, because raising their torsos too high meant attracting a bullet. Some whispered to themselves, others cried without realizing. The instinct had taken the place of thought. It was no longer about strategy, it was about crossing that space by any means necessary. Historically, accounts from the Eastern Front show how the terrain devastated by artillery and human losses often created this kind of macabre advance. In battles such as Rzhev, Stalingrad, and Kursk, survivors describe fields where the ground seemed alive, from the constant movement of wounded soldiers trying to crawl while new waves swept over them. And that's exactly what was happening there. A Soviet soldier dove after a comrade who had fallen seconds before. Another used the crater left by a grenade as a stopping point just to catch his breath before the next lunge. Some didn't even know if what lay ahead was Earth, or someone who wouldn't move again. In the trenches, the Germans adjusted their sights downwards, trying to hit these almost invisible targets. But the angle was bad. With every meter the Soviets gained, the power of the machine. Guns diminished. Shots ricocheted off scattered pieces of metal. Bullets buried themselves in bodies before losing force. The horror wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The defenders were beginning to understand that the massacre was not stopping the advance. It was, unintentionally, building the path. Each setback made the next advance a little more possible. And the worst part of all, there were still enough men behind to keep coming. Within the German trenches, dug into the frozen earth. Like open veins in the flesh of a dying continent, something was beginning to break, and it wasn't the defensive line yet. That barrier of barbed wire, mines and concrete bunkers that seemed eternal beneath the blanket of snow stained with blood and soot. No, what was breaking was invisible, intangible, but infinitely more devastating. It was what pulsed within the men, those souls hardened by war, molded in the furnaces of past battles, but now exposed to a hell that transcended mere physical combat. It was the human spirit, fragile as crystal under the weight of an invisible hammer, cracking little by little, echoing a silent snap that only the soldiers themselves could hear in their tormented minds. At the start of the attack, when the first artillery flashes tore through the grey sky like the blades of an angry god, training spoke louder, echoing like a mantra repeated in distant camps, on forced marches through Ukraine or occupied Poland. Identifying targets, trained eyes scanned. The hazy horizon, distinguishing human silhouettes from the deceptive shadows of the morning mist. Controlling breathing, inhale slowly, exhale precisely, ignoring the vapor that escaped from mouths like souls fleeing condemned bodies. Changing the machine gun barrel, calloused hands, hardened by years of handling cold weapons, turned the mechanisms with the efficiency of Swiss watches, even when the metal burned the skin through torn gloves. Reloading, ammunition belts snaked like venomous snakes, feeding the mechanical beasts that spat death in rhythmic bursts. Fire again, finger on the trigger, an automatic gesture, a survival ritual that had saved lives in dozens of ambushes and counterattacks. All mechanical, almost automatic, as if the bodies were mere cogs in a war machine designed to last forever. But as the minutes dragged on, turning into hours that seemed like eternities condensed into a broken clock, and the Soviets continued to advance despite absurd losses, piles of bodies accumulating like mounds of human rubble, arms and legs intertwined in grotesque poses of final agony. The minds of the defenders began to fail, like an overcharged engine that emits smoke before exploding. They were used to seeing the enemy retreat, as in the initial victories of 1941, when panzer divisions swept across the Russian plains, leaving behind burning villages and thousands of prisoners, marching eastward with the illusion of a quick and glorious war. Accustomed to seeing a charge stall, as at Kharkov or Kursk, where the Soviet momentum broke against walls of steel and fire, forcing the attackers to burrow into the earth like cornered animals. Accustomed to seeing men collapse to the ground and never get up again, their bodies becoming part of the landscape, fertilizing the soil with blood that froze into red crystals under the merciless winter. But this was different, a nightmare that defied the logic of war as they knew it. The landscape ahead shifted, even, covered in corpses, a macabre tapestry of torn uniforms, crushed helmets, and faces frozen in expressions of eternal surprise. Among the bodies, figures kept emerging, like ghosts rising from a living graveyard. A helmet here, emerging from the snow like a crown of thorns. An arm pulling a body forward there, fingers digging into the frozen earth like the claws of a hungry demon. a man rising for 2 seconds to run 3 more steps before collapsing, his body writhing in final spasms as tracer bullets illuminated his silhouette against the leaden sky. It was like trying to empty the sea with a bucket, a Sisyphean task where each drop removed was replaced by an entire ocean, a deluge of humanity that refused to dry up. A German sniper, a veteran of the 1941 campaign, that golden year for the Reich, when Moscow seemed within reach and the Red Army dissolved into panic and desertions, murmured something that no one answered, his hoarse voice echoing in the emptiness of the trench like the lament of a man already dead inside. "They are endless." The words hung in the icy air, mingling with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burnt flesh, a smell that permeated the nostrils and seeped into dreams, transforming nights into eternal repetitions of horror. Fear changed form, evolving from something punctual into a multifaceted monster. It was no longer the fear of dying from a gunshot or explosion, those everyday risks that soldiers learned to accept as the price of loyalty to the Führer. It was a deeper, more primal fear, the fear of being swallowed up, of being absorbed by an inexorable mass, as if the Russian continent itself, with its infinite vastness and murderous winters, were taking revenge, devouring the invaders one by one in its bottomless gullet. His ears buzzed incessantly, a constant hum like that of enraged bees trapped inside his skull, a result of the artillery barrage that preceded the attack, those seemingly endless Soviet cannons spitting shells that transformed the earth into a sea of smoking craters. The mixture of biting cold, temperatures plunging below zero, freezing sweat into icy crusts on the skin, adrenaline pulsing like poison in the veins, and constant noise created a sense of unreality, as if the whole world were a fever dream of a madman, where time distorted and sanity dissolved. Some men fired too quickly, missing targets that seemed to multiply like dancing shadows, their wasted bullets cutting through the air uselessly, fueling only the growing panic. Others grew too slow, staring blankly at the field as if their brains had frozen, their eyes glazed over at a distant point where a lone Soviet soldier crawled, inch by inch, defying death with a determination bordering on the supernatural. Historically, German soldiers on the Eastern Front reported exactly this kind of mental exhaustion during major Soviet offensives, such as Operation Uranus at Stalingrad, where the Soviet encirclement turned heroes into haunted ghosts, or Operation Bagration in 1944, when entire armies were annihilated in a few weeks, leaving survivors with blank stares and crushed souls. German firepower was enormous. MG-42 machine guns, nicknamed Hitler's chainsaw for their terrifying sound and infernal rate of fire of 1-200 rounds per minute. But the psychological impact of facing continuous attacks without pause, without negotiation, eroded confidence like acid on metal. The question began to surface, even if no one wanted to say. It aloud, echoing in minds like a treacherous whisper. What if we just can't stop this? It was the seed of doubt, planted in fertile ground of exhaustion and terror, growing like a weed that choked the will to fight. A gunner shouted that the crates were dwindling, his voice cut off by the howling wind carrying snowflakes mixed with ash from distant explosions as he dragged heavy crates through the muddy trench, his muscles trembling not only from the effort but from the dread that the next burst would be his last. Another struggled to loosen an overheated pipe with stiff, ice-cold gloves, his numb fingers burning at the touch of the incandescent metal, steam rising like tormented souls in the frozen air, and in his mind, visions of exploding pipes, mutilating comrades into unrecognizable pieces. A third tried to wake a comrade who lay motionless, not from visible injury, no blood gushing, no exposed bones, but because his mind had simply shut down, his eyes open but empty, like windows to an inner abyss where terror had consumed everything, leaving only an empty cocoon of a man who once laughed and dreamed of distant homes in Bavaria or Prussia. And yet, they kept firing. The triggers pulled by instinct, by habit, by a vestige of racial pride that the Nazi regime had instilled in them, promising superiority over the subhumans of the East. Because now the enemy was close enough to see their faces, young faces, many of them teenagers torn from Siberian farms or Leningrad factories, dirty with mud and soot, with eyes burning with determination mixed with primal fear, frightened faces mirroring their own, revealing shared humanity amidst the chaos. Humans, yes, with mothers weeping in distant villages, with dreams truncated by war, with fragile bodies that broke like theirs. And that made it all worse, transforming the enemy from a hated abstraction into a terrifying reflection where each hit was a broken mirror reflecting their own mortality. The Kame. German lines still stood, a stubborn barrier against the red deluge, but inside it was beginning to crack, invisible fissures spreading like spider webs on glass, threatening to collapse in a total meltdown of despair and madness. Terror settled in like a parasite, devouring courage, leaving only the emptiness of hopelessness, where every breath was an act of defiance against the inevitable. When the Germans thought they had seen the worst, that field of carnage where bodies piled up like firewood for an infernal bonfire, the wounded groaning in prolonged agony, the air thick with a metallic stench of blood and cordite that clung to the throat like bile. They realized, with a shiver running down their spine like the icy fingers of a spectre, that all of that, the dead stretched out in grotesque poses, the wounded crawling like blind worms, the field transformed into an impossible scene from a painter driven mad by apocalyptic visions, was still only the beginning, the prelude to a greater act in an opera of destruction that stretched beyond the hazy horizon. Back there, beyond the acrid smoke rising from the craters like condemned souls ascending to hell, and the low fog clinging to the ground like a living shroud, movement was again insinuating itself, subtle at first, like the tremor before a devastating earthquake. More men were rising, silhouettes emerging from the mist like ghosts summoned from an underworld of hatred and vengeance, their brown uniforms merging with the battered earth, weapons raised like talismans against imminent death. The second wave did not come with savage screams like the first, those primitive roars that echoed across the steppes, laden with ancestral fury and vodka distributed to dull the fear. No, it came lower, more spread out, learning from the massacre ahead, a real-time Darwinian adaptation where Soviet officers, those commissars hardened by Stalinist purges and bloody battles, had observed through dirty binoculars, adjusting the rhythm with the coldness of surgeons dissecting a living body. It was no longer a compact block, a human mass easy to harvest like ripe wheat. They were scattered groups, spaced unevenly, using each smoking crater as an improvised trench, each mound of earth raised by explosions as a precarious shield, each inert body as macabre camouflage, crawling over the fallen as if treading on carpets of flesh. The attack hadn't stopped. It had only changed form, evolving from a brutal tide into an insidious infiltration, a hydra that regenerated severed heads, multiplying terror in overlapping layers. The Germans barely had time to breathe between bursts, their lungs burning with the icy, polluted air, when new targets began to appear in their peripheral vision, flashing like malevolent mirages. Some soldiers in the trenches let out a nervous, short laugh, almost a sob that echoed like the cry of a child lost in the darkness. It wasn't humor. Ah, no. Humor had died along with the first. Comrades struck. It was the mind trying not to break, a fragile defense mechanism against the abyss of madness opening at their feet. Another one? Already, someone murmured, their voice faltering like a violin string stretched to its limit, trembling with the weight of disbelief and despair that seeped in like ice water through punctured boots. Yes, another one. And behind it, more. An inexorable flow that seemed to defy the laws of physics and humanity, as if the Red Army were a living entity, a leviathan of millions of souls fused into a collective will of annihilation. This type of layered offensive occurred in several Soviet operations, especially when the priority was to break through the line at any cost, as in the Battle of Berlin in 1945, where successive waves of infantry and tanks crushed the crumbling Nazi defenses, or in the recapture of Sevastopol, where the Black Sea witnessed horrors that made veteran sailors vomit. The idea was simple, but diabolically effective. Not give the defender time to reorganize, to cool weapons that smoked like infernal cauldrons, to redistribute scarce ammunition that slipped away like sand through one's fingers, or to calm nerves that vibrated like exposed electrical wires. The pressure had to be constant, suffocating, like a vice tightening around the skull until rational thought dissolved into pure panic. The field now seemed to move in several places at once, an organized chaos where death danced in unpredictable patterns. One group crawled to the right, bodies glued to the ground like venomous snakes, taking advantage of the subtle slope of the terrain to avoid crossfire. Another advanced, leaping from crater to crater, desperate jumps that ended in explosions of earth and muffled screams. A third used the slight elevation of the terrain to reduce exposure, low silhouettes like elongated shadows at sunset, each step a gamble against fate. The losses remained heavy, bodies falling like severed string puppets, spurts of blood painting the snow a vivid red that quickly darkened to brown, but the distance visibly decreased, inch by inch, like an inexorable tide advancing on a doomed beach. The German machine guns no longer had the same initial rhythm, that furious staccato that once intimidated entire armies. The barrels gleamed with heat, red as glowing iron, steam rising even in the frozen air, creating ghostly halos that seemed like demonic auras. Changes took precious seconds, trembling hands struggling with greasy mechanisms while the enemy gained ground. Getting close enough for grenades to start falling into the trenches, explosions that maimed and deafened, rifles jammed with dirt and ice, delicate mechanisms freezing like hearts petrified by terror, requiring desperate blows to function. Tired hands took longer to load a new magazine, numb fingers slipping, ammunition falling into the mud where it was lost forever. And then came the third wave, unannounced by trumpets or flags, unorganized, like the previous ones, with precise formations and shouted orders. Simply more men, emerging behind the first survivors, sprouting from the earth, as if the Russian soil, saturated with the blood of generations, were vomiting its accumulated vengeance. To the defenders, it seemed supernatural, a biblical curse where the dead rose to march alongside the living, a horde that defied counting, multiplying like plagues in a living apocalypse. The field no longer had clear lines. It was a chaos of low movement, isolated explosions that illuminated pale faces in strobe flashes, short shots that echoed like echoes of a nightmare, cries lost in the wind that carried the lament of the dying like a symphony of pain. The terror was now mathematical, a cold and merciless equation calculated in exhausted minds. How many boxes remained, piled like precarious tombs in the trench? How many spare barrels, each a temporary savior against the inevitable overheating? How many men could still fire without trembling, without their hands betraying the dread that gnawed at their muscles? And the answer in every head was the same, a silent verdict that echoed like a funeral bell. Less than necessary, far less. Despair settled in like a dense fog, suffocating hope, transforming warriors into shadows of themselves, while the next wave, and there would be a next one, there always would be, approached inexorably, promising the final embrace of total annihilation. While the fighting raged ahead, a chaos of flames, smoke, and dancing silhouettes in the icy mist of the Russian dawn, where each explosion echoed like the roar of a primal beast awakening from a millennia-long slumber. Another battle was taking place behind the Soviet lines, a battle invisible to the entrenched Germans, but felt by every man who advanced, pulsing in their veins like a slow, inexorable poison, a constant reminder that death came not only from the distant enemy, but also from the nearby shadows, from those who should have been allies but transformed into merciless executioners. It was a war within a war, a theater of psychological terror where fear bifurcated, attacking from the front and from behind, trapping soldiers in a web of despair where the only apparent escape was a blind advance into the abyss. Behind the assault waves, positioned at strategic points, low hills covered in dirty snow, edges of skeletal forests where twisted pines stood like mute sentinels, or hastily dug trenches in the frozen earth that crunched under boots were the NKVD's blocking units and control detachments, men in dark uniforms with gazes as cold as the steel of their Tokarev pistols, bearing insignia that evoked the absolute power of the Soviet state, a power that tolerated neither weakness nor hesitation, nor the luxury of humanity in times of existential crisis. These were not troops sent to seize enemy trenches, to scale walls of fire, or to face the roar of German machine guns. His role was different, cold and direct, calculated with the precision of a bureaucrat in a distant Moscow office, to prevent unauthorized retreat, to transform the battlefield into an open prison where retreat was punished with the same severity as desertion, where a step backward could mean the abrupt end of an already precarious life. This practice existed at various critical moments of the war, especially during the most desperate periods for the Soviet Union, such as the dark days of 1941, when Nazi hordes swept across the western borders, swallowing entire armies in cauldrons of annihilation, leaving behind ruined cities and terrified populations fleeing eastward in endless columns of misery, or during the heroic but bloody defense of Leningrad, where the Nazi siege transformed the city into a living tomb, with hunger devouring bodies from the inside out, and the blockade units ensured that no soldier abandoned his post, even as the ice of Lake Ladoga broke beneath the feet of reinforcements, or even in the Battle of Stalingrad, that urban hell where gutted buildings served as trenches, and commissars patrolled the rubble-covered streets, summarily executing those who faltered, transforming the Volga into a barrier not only geographical, but also of state terror. Rigid orders emanating directly from Stalin and his iron-fisted inner circle, decrees such as Order Number 227, known as "Not a Step Back," proclaimed in July 1942 amidst the panic of the German offensive in the south, demanded maintaining offensive pressure at any cost, where retreat without authorization could be treated as desertion, punishable by immediate execution by firing squad, without trial, without mercy, only the dry crack of a shot to the back of the neck echoing as a warning to the others. The result was an invisible line on the soldiers' own backs, a ghostly border drawn not by barbed wire, but by primal fear, a barrier separating the illusion of survival from the abyss of summary execution. The men who advanced knew this, the knowledge ingrained in their souls, like the frost covering their worn coats, a knowledge that needed no words to be understood, but manifested itself in furtive glances back, in rapid breaths that mixed steam with dread. They didn't need to see the gun barrel pointed behind them, those Mosin Nagant rifles or PPSH-41 machine guns raised by the firm hands of commissars who had survived the purges of the 1930s, hardened by the Stalinist paranoia that saw traitors in every shadow, to feel its presence, cold and oppressive as the Siberian wind cutting through exposed flesh. It was enough to remember the examples, the stories whispered around flickering campfires in makeshift camps, where veterans with old scars told of comrades dragged into the darkness of night for minor violations, their cries muffled by the distant roar of artillery. From the rumors that spread through the units like epidemics, speaking of entire platoons decimated not by the enemy, but by their own guards, of mothers receiving cold letters informing them of heroic deaths when the truth was a traitorous bullet in the back. Fear came from two sides. The German fire ahead, with its merciless bursts that claimed lives in seconds, turning men into severed puppets, and the consequences of stopping behind, where death was more personal, more humiliating, a summary judgment executed by those who should have protected, turning brothers into executioners. This created an extreme psychological state, a vortex of terror where the human mind, already weakened by sleep deprivation, chronic hunger, and the constant sensory assault of war, writhed in knots of despair, like a rope stretched to its limit, about to snap into tatters. Some soldiers advanced out of patriotism, an inner fire fueled by propaganda that painted the Nazi invader as absolute evil, evoking images of burned villages, massacred families, and the motherland bleeding under foreign boots. Out of anger, a bubbling fury against the Germans who had transformed their lands into extermination camps, where each step forward was a personal revenge for loved ones lost in Babi Yar or other abysses of horror, or out of a desire for vengeance, a visceral hatred that transcended the rational, propelling exhausted bodies beyond human limits. Others out of discipline, trained in barracks where obedience was hammered in like nails, where questioning orders was synonymous with fatal weakness. Others simply because the panic of retreating was greater than the panic of rushing forward, an equation of terrors where the unknown behind, the possibility of being branded a coward, dragged to an improvised tribunal, or shot right there, their body left as an example for those who came after, eclipsed the visible horror of tracer bullets and grenades exploding ahead. In the field, this translated into something the Germans couldn't understand, a phenomenon that challenged their vision of racial and tactical superiority, seeing in the Soviets not humans, but subhuman hordes driven by a collective madness, wounded men trying to get up again, their bodies torn by shrapnel, blood gushing in rhythmic pulses, yet still crawling forward with groans that mixed pain and determination, as if life refused to be extinguished under the weight of agony. Soldiers who clearly wanted to throw themselves to the ground and stay there, buried in the snow like living tombs, eyes glazed over on the grey sky, begging for mercy, but forcing their bodies to continue, muscles trembling in rebellion against the minds that propelled them, driven by watchful gazes behind them. Groups that, even reduced by half, comrades fallen in grotesque piles, arms outstretched in silent pleas, faces frozen in masks of eternal surprise, still tried to keep moving, stumbling over the dead, using them as involuntary shields, each advance a testament to a forced resilience that bordered on the supernatural. It wasn't an absence of fear. Oh no, the fear was there, alive and voracious, devouring entrails like an insatiable parasite, manifesting itself in racing hearts that seemed about to explode in the chest, in trembling hands that barely held weapons, in blurred visions of unshed tears. It was a system that pushed fear in a single direction, channeling it like a dammed river that could only flow forward, transforming terror into fuel for advancement, where stopping meant total collapse, surrender not to the enemy, but to the internal. Terror that the regime had cultivated with cruel mastery. Advance, always advance, even when lungs burned with the icy air, when legs weakened under the weight of soaked backpacks, when the horizon blurred into a mirage of imminent death. Survivor accounts describe this moment as a kind of mental tunnel, a contraction of reality where the vast theater of war was reduced to a narrow, dark corridor, illuminated only by flashes of explosions and tracer rounds. A tunnel where the echo of one's own footsteps mingled with the distant drumming of machine guns, and the air thickened with the stench of sweat, gunpowder, and primal fear. The world shrank, compressing itself into tiny fragments. There was no more global strategy, those large arrows on staff maps drawn by generals in heated bunkers. There was no politics, the communist ideals or the promises of a radiant future that seemed like cruel jokes amidst the chaos. There was no future, only the eternal present of immediate survival. Only the next meter, a treacherous stretch of land that could explode into mines or open into smoking craters. The next crater, a life-saving hole where one could huddle for precious seconds, ignoring the groans of the wounded nearby. The next makeshift shelter was a mound of earth or a destroyed tank that offered illusory protection against the deluge of lead. Meanwhile, in the German trenches, the defenders saw only the end result of this brutal mechanism, a human war machine operating with the efficiency of a meat mill, spitting out incessant waves of attackers, seemingly immune to the logic of fatigue and terror. A pressure that did not diminish, even as the field became a carpet of bodies, even as the air vibrated with the buzz of bullets and the thunder of cannons. They did not see the weapons pointed at their backs, those cold barrels raised by commissars with impassive faces, eyes that had witnessed too much horror to blink. They did not see the summary executions, the bodies, fallen not by enemy fire, but by perceived betrayal, left as warning markers in the stained snow. They only saw men who kept coming, even when everything in the human body told them to stop. Muscles screaming for rest, minds begging for sanity, souls crying out for peace. And that was the most terrifying part of all, a terror that transcended the physical, infiltrating the depths of the German psyche, questioning its own humanity as it confronted a determination that seemed to defy the laws of nature, transforming the enemy into something inhuman, a collective spectre that devoured everything in its path, leaving behind only the echo of hopelessness and the silence of the fallen. Despair settled in like a plague, corroding the will to resist, while the Soviet advance, driven by this double terror, threatened to engulf the known world in a vortex of blood and eternal snow. Every defensive line has a limit. It's not just a physical limit, it's a human limit. After hours in extreme cold, bombardment, constant tension, and almost non-stop gunfire, the Germans were no longer just fighting the enemy. They were fighting their own bodies. Heavy arms, numb fingers, eyes burning with smoke and exhaustion. Their minds began to fail them in small ways, forgetting a magazine, missing a simple command, taking a second too long to react. And in war, a second is an eternity. The machine guns that once roared incessantly now had pauses, short but real. Barrels needed to cool down. Loaders trembled as they opened new boxes. Some positions already had less than half of their initial ammunition. That's when it happened. In one section of the line, slightly lower than the rest, where the terrain formed an almost imperceptible depression, the Soviets managed to get closer than at any other point. Using crater upon crater, bodies and debris, they had shortened the distance meter by meter. A German sniper tried to adjust his sights to that sector, but his weapon malfunctioned. It jammed. He slammed the bolt shut, cursing, while the soldier next to him shouted for more ammunition that hadn't yet arrived. It was the space that was missing. 3, then 5, then a dozen Soviet soldiers emerged almost simultaneously from behind a crater large enough to conceal a truck. They ran, hunched over, shouting, firing wildly just to keep their heads down in the trench. A grenade flew. It fell short. It rolled through the dirty snow. It exploded at the edge of the German position, filling the shelter with earth, ice, and splinters of wood. One of the defenders fell backward, hands to his face, and then, for the first time that day, Soviet boots touched the outer edge of the trench. It wasn't a complete collapse. Not yet, but it was a crack. And cracks in defensive lines are like cracks in the ice of a frozen lake. They start small, and then spread too quickly to be contained. The Germans nearby saw the peripheral movement and felt their blood run cold in a way that was different from the cold itself. The line, which until then had been a firm barrier, now had a soft spot, and the enemy was entering through it. When the first Soviets jumped into the trenches, the course of the war changed instantly. The distant noise of machine guns faded into the background. Now the sound was different. Panting breaths just inches away, boots slipping in the frozen mud, short screams, the dry crack of shots fired almost at close range to the enemy's body. There were no more lines. There was no distance left, only men inside a space too small for so much fear. The first Soviet soldier who fell into the earthen ditch slipped and was nearly knocked over by the weight of his equipment. Before he could get up, a German appeared around the bend in the trench. The two stared at each other for a split second, young, dirty, eyes wide. The German fired first. The shot echoed deafeningly in that narrow corridor. The Soviet fell backward, but another was already coming up. Behind him, grenades began flying within the line itself. Some exploded too close, scattering dirt and wood on both sides. Bayonets were fixed almost without looking. Trench shovels, short, sharp, became improvised weapons. The fighting there was not organized. It was instinctive. A German tried to take a few steps back to gain firing range, but bumped into another soldier behind him. There was nowhere to go. A Soviet emerged from the smoke, and the two collided, falling together. The rifle fired. Sideways, the bullet ricocheting off the earthen wall. Hands gripped coats, belts, arms, trying to push the other down. Combat reports from the Eastern Front speak extensively of this type of moment, when the conflict ceased to be industrial and reverted to something almost primitive. The cold, the exhaustion, the constant noise reduced everything to basic reactions, to attack, to survive, to breathe. The men were shouting in different languages, but the sound was the same. Pain, anger, fear. The cramped space amplified everything. The smell of burnt gunpowder mingled with that of damp earth and old sweat. The vapor of breath mixed with the smoke from the explosions, creating a thick fog where silhouettes suddenly appeared, just a few steps away. And while this was happening in that sector, more Soviets continued to enter through the breach that had been opened. The fight was no longer about square meters of field space. It was at every bend in the trench, each shelter, every step. And nobody there was sure who still controlled the line. Amid the hand-to-hand chaos, a different sound began to grow from behind the Soviet lines. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't a machine gun. It was a deep, heavy, metallic rumble, as if the ground itself were creaking. The Germans, who could still hear above the gunfire, felt their stomachs clench. They knew that sound. They had heard it before, rushing through the snow, through mud, crushing fences and trees, armored vehicle engines. The breach, opened in the line, was not merely a local infantry success. It was the signal that the mechanized forces were waiting for. Soviet doctrine, when it worked, followed this principle. The infantry bled to open the hole, and the tanks came in to turn a hole into a breach. From the fog and smoke emerged the low, wide shapes of the T-34s, covered in frozen mud, shrapnel marks on their armor. They weren't coming in an organized parade. They were advancing through craters, dodging debris with infantry, running close to their flanks whenever possible. The first tank that appeared fired almost non-stop, its 76mm gun spitting fire against deeper German defensive positions. The impact blew open a wooden and earthen shelter a few meters behind the contested trench, sending beams and men flying through the air. Within the German positions, panic spread faster than orders. Machine guns were almost useless against armor. Rifles, too. Few anti-tank weapons remained in that sector, and many had already been damaged by the initial bombardment or were out of adequate ammunition. A soldier tried to rotate an anti-tank gun into position, his hands slipping on the icy metal. He yelled for help, but all around, hand-to-hand combat still raged. There was no coordination, only immediate survival. The tanks didn't need to destroy everything on their own. Their mere presence already made a difference. The Soviet infantry, which had previously crawled, now advanced on foot behind the armored vehicles, using the steel hull as a mobile shield. They fired into the German positions while the T-34s crushed barbed wire, sandbags, and any light cover they could find. This was the moment the Germans feared most, when the defense ceased to be a line and turned into isolated pockets. The torn section began to pull the sides together, like fabric tearing. The attack that began with men running under machine gun fire had now acquired steel teeth. and the sound of the engines mingled with the screams, the gunshots and the explosions, a sound that clearly said the battle had changed phases, and the line was collapsing. When the tanks broke through the gap and the Soviet infantry began to spread behind the first line, the German defense ceased to be a continuous wall and became something fragmented, confused, and full of blind spots. And that's how positions fall in modern warfare, not all at once, but by parts that cease to be seen. The trenches that still held out to the right and left of the breached sector began to realize something was wrong. Shots were coming from unexpected angles. Messengers sent to deliver orders were not returning. Communication wires, already damaged by the bombardment, were dead. The local command no longer had a clear view of what was happening. A German group in a flanking position continued firing forward at an enemy that was no longer there. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers emerged from the flank, advancing through sections of trench that should have been secure. That's when the word started circulating by word of mouth, without radio, without official confirmation. They went in. The effect was immediate. Some men fought even more fiercely, like cornered animals. Others felt the ground disappear beneath their feet. The idea of being surrounded on the Eastern Front had an enormous psychological weight. Encirclement often meant slow death, starvation, cold, or capture. Officers were trying to organize a secondary line a few meters behind, using depressions in the terrain and remnants of old positions. But retreating under pressure is one of the most difficult maneuvers there is. To leave the trench, the soldier needed to expose himself, and the field, even destroyed, was still under fire. The wounded, unable to walk, were left behind, many begging, others simply watching, too weak to speak. The cold began its silent work on them. The T-34s advanced deeper now, not as fast, but steadily, supported by infantry that cleared the shelters one by one. Grenades were thrown into bunker entrances. Makeshift doors were broken down with gunfire. The German defense, previously organized in interconnected sectors, was breaking down into isolated pockets, fighting on their own. This type of local collapse happened countless times in the war in the East. It wasn't always immediate extermination, but a loss of cohesion. And on a front line, cohesion is everything. When it disappears, resistance becomes individual resistance. Individual resistance alone is not enough to hold the battlefront. That German position, which in the morning had seemed firm, was now in disarray in some places, desperate fighting in others, and deadly silence in still others. The tide had turned, and he wasn't coming back. When the smoke began to spread more slowly, and the noise receded a few meters beyond the old German trenches, the field that had been swept across by the Soviet waves was left behind, and that's when the real cost became apparent. The terrain seemed unrecognizable. There were no longer clear lines between snow, earth, and men. Equipment was scattered everywhere: helmets, broken rifles, torn backpacks, letters that had slipped from pockets. The cold cruelly preserved the scene, as if time had stopped so that no one would forget. Soviet medical teams began to advance, moving quickly among the survivors. They shouted numbers, asked for help carrying the wounded, tried to identify who was still breathing. Many men were in absolute silence, eyes open to the grey sky, already motionless. Others groaned softly, almost voiceless, the vapor of their weak breath in the icy air. Some of the wounded tried to crawl even after the line had advanced, as if their bodies were still obeying the order to keep going. Only when someone held them did they realize they had survived, at least for now. Historically, offensives of this type were costly for the Red Army. Even when successful, the losses could be devastating. The strategy of constant pressure broke through defenses, but it exacted a gigantic human cost. Entire divisions would emerge from an attack with half, sometimes less, of the men they had at the start. Soviet officers walked across the field with hard expressions, but their eyes betrayed the weight of their suffering. They had achieved their tactical objective. The line had been broken, the tanks advanced, the enemy retreated. But the path was paved by his own men. Some soldiers who could still walk avoided looking at the ground. Others stopped for a second, recognized a familiar face, and kept going, because war didn't allow time for mourning. The wind swept across the field, kicking up fine snow everywhere, as if trying to cover it all. But nothing there would be forgotten by those who saw it. Victory was within reach, and even so, nobody felt like a winner. These massive Red Army attacks went far beyond a local victory. They were part of a decisive shift in the Soviet way of fighting, constant pressure, successive waves, and rapid exploitation of breaches sustained by enormous human and industrial capacity. Even with enormous losses, this strategy wore Germany down, forcing the Wehrmacht to retreat and lose the initiative on the Eastern Front. For the Germans, there remained the feeling of facing an enemy that never stopped coming. For the Soviets, every advance was a fight for national survival. At the level of the common soldier, the impact was permanent. The horror of close combat, the sound of weapons, and the memory of surviving by centimeters. The war was decided not only by generals, but meter by meter, man by man.